what a sourdough is, it's a combination of both a yeast, wild yeast, and bacteria working and feeding off starches in the flour. They produce both acetic acid and lactic acid, and this is what gives your sourdough its sour characteristics. So how do we start it off? Well, we started off with a ratio. In here I've got 80 grams of baker's flour and I've got 20 grams of rye flour. Into a bowl, and to that I'm going to then add about 120 mils of water. Mix it until it forms a paste. Okay. And then we allow that to sit for 24 hours in a warm environment, as close to 28 degrees as possible. After 24 hours, we should start to see very small bubbles inside our mixture. At that point, we then need to feed it. We now take 100 grams of what we did 24 hours ago, and we mix 100 grams of flour and 100 grams of water, and we mix that into a paste. Now we leave that sit for 8 hours at 28 degrees until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, okay, and then we refeed it again. We want to promote yeast activity. So the more we feed a levain, or the more we feed a starter, the more yeast we will allow to grow and the more food source it will have, so it will become stronger. If we only feed it once a day, the acidity levels will build and our yeast activity will decline. So after day 6, we should have a fully matured liquid levain. Now we know it's in good condition because there is no high tide mark. It hasn't come up the side of the container and dropped. We've got large bubbles and small bubbles on the surface. And it also starts to look like a brain, the surface of the brain. So we've got these little seams that are forming on the top of our dough. That's in really good condition, and that's going to make a really nice sourdough when it goes into our loaf of bread. So we've gone through the process of making our sourdough culture. At the end of creating our sourdough culture, we've decided, do we want a stiff levain or a liquid levain? I like to use a stiff levain. It's a little bit easier for me to work in a commercial bakery, but at home a liquid levain might be easier for you. So let's have a look at a stiff levain. How do we know a stiff levain is in good condition? Well, we look at it. This has been sitting overnight for around about 12 hours, and we can see that it is nice and got a nice volume to it, but the secret to a sourdough is that it's not sticky or pasty. It's still got strength in the dough and still got integrity. If we let this prove too long, what happens is the acidity builds up too much and it starts to break itself down. If you put a sourdough culture inside a bread dough that is starting to break down, then it will have the same effect on the dough. It'll start to break down your main dough because it's too acidic. Let's have a look at one that is overripe, okay? And we call it a ripe. And you can see that this is pasty and sticky and it sticks all over my fingers. This is not in a good condition. So we wouldn't want to use this. We could just refeed that and then put off our bread making until tomorrow, but we wouldn't want to use it if it's in a pasty form. So this is in a good condition. It's nice and tight. It's got beautiful structure. You can see we've got yeast activity underneath it and it's ready to go inside our sourdough. So what does our dough consist of? Well, very simple. It has bread flour. Remember, there are 5 proteins in flour: gliadin, glutenin, globulin, albumin, and protease. 3 of those are really important for us to know about as bakers. 2 of them, gliadin and glutenin, chemically bond together in the process in the presence of water to form gluten. And this gives our dough the ability to stretch, but also to hold its shape. So I'm using Lauke Wallaby Baker's flour at 11.5%. Salt. Salt gives me yeast control, okay? It slows down the chemical reactions and slows down the food source to our yeast and our bacteria. So it's really important. This also gives us flavour, but it also gives us crust colour as well. This helps with the browning of our our chemical reactions when our bread is in the oven. So salt is really important. The other ingredient I add to mine, I add a little bit of dry yeast, okay? Some people don't, some people do. I add a little bit of dry yeast just because it helps me with a slightly lighter product, 0.1%, but you can leave it out if you want. And the other ingredient is water. Water is really important. This is what determines the hydration or the viscosity of the dough. Obviously, the higher you go in water, the more fluid the dough is, but the harder it is for you to work. So if you're starting off on sourdough, my recommendation would be that you start with a slightly drier dough, but then you can, as you get better, you can migrate to a more hydrated dough. So these are our base ingredients for making bread and sourdough, so let's get mixing. 5 minutes on first speed, 2.3 minutes on second speed, should give me a dough of around about 75% gluten development, and with the right calculations, a final dough temperature of somewhere between 24 and 26 degrees. So you can hand mix doughs and you can get a really good result. Obviously with machines, the machines do the work for you, but every machine is different. So on this machine, this handles 100 kilos of dough, and I know that it mixes for around about 2.3 minutes on second speed. If you're using a KitchenAid or a smaller machine at home, you might need to work out how long you need to mix it on second speed. It all depends on the size of the bowl and the actual size of the dough that you've got inside it. What you're looking for in a KitchenAid is you don't want it to be sitting on top of the hook, you want it to be interacting with the bowl. Gluten is only formed when the dough is folded, so you need to mix it on your second speed is when you start to see the dough folding on the side of the bowl, and we call that second speed. Once we have an understanding of what is influencing our bread, we can then control it. Most problems at home in a domestic setting will be temperature related problems. Either the dough is too hot or the dough is too cold and it's not proving exactly the same way as you think it should. A thermometer is important. You've got to know what your final dough temperatures are. So this is called a shaggy dough. This is the point where we will decide, do we need more water in it or not, okay? But you can see that gluten is forming and it relaxes and it starts to flow ever so slightly. So I'm happy with that dough. So we'll continue to mix on first speed and then we'll go into second speed. We had a final dough temperature of 25 degrees. We know the friction on this machine is 2.3 degrees, so we take 25, take away 2.3 equals 22.7. We times that by 4 because there are 4 factors that are now influencing our dough. 22.7 times 4 equals 90.8. We then need to take the temperature of our room. So let's say our room is 24 degrees, okay? Let's say the flour that we have is 22, okay? Our pre-ferment is 18, okay? We add all those numbers up, okay? We have 22, 46, 56, 64, okay? So we go 90.8 take away 64 equals 26.8. So if I have my water at 26.8 degrees and I mix it for 2.3 minutes, it will come out of my machine at 25 degrees every single time. Now this changes every time we make bread because our flour temperature and our room temperature and our pre-ferment temperature vary and fluctuate throughout the year. So we always go through, every time we make bread, we do these calculations to make sure that it is always the same every single time. Every machine is different. So what you need to do is you need to find out what your machine does. How much friction does it impart into the dough? And if you're hand mixing, well, we don't have any friction because we can't knead strongly enough to create any friction. So it's simply 25 times 4 equals 100, and then we go through the same process, so this end temperature will change because there's no friction. The dough has gone through its bulk proofing stage. We're now ready to go into this next stage, which is the scale and dividing. So we're going to make a little Vienna. So I'm going to scale out 650 grams per loaf. By having the same weight in your loaves, it means that they will prove and it means they will bake exactly the same amount of time. We can't leave these like this, we need to put them into their pre-shape shape. So depending on what we do, we're going to make them into either rounds for the Viennas and we're going to make little cylinders for the baguette. So I like to put my loaves onto wooden boards just so it helps protect the temperature of the dough. Remove any excess flour off your bench because this will start to change the hydration of your dough and it will stop the dough from gripping to the bench. So all we want to do is fold it over itself. We want to make a nice round tight dough. Okay. All the time we mould from underneath, we never mould from the top. So using our hands, sliding and rolling, crimping it underneath and allowing that beautiful smooth surface to be created on top. This is what traps the gas in our loaf of bread. If we just have it loose, we're allowing the gas to escape. So round it up. So moulding from underneath. With the baguettes, what we want to create is a cylinder. So all we want to do is flatten it out. Whenever we use doing bread making, we never use claws, we only use the flats of our hands. Okay, flatten it out, square off your ends, get the top edge, fold it down, top edge, fold it down, sealing it against on the bench, and then just tightening it up from underneath to create a little cylinder. So we'll do that again, use the flats of our hands, square off, top edge down, top edge down, top edge down, seal, tighten. So this is telling the gluten which way we want it to go when we come into our final shape. We've scaled them, we've divided them, we've pre-shaped them. Now they need to go into what we call an intermediate proof, which is just a little bit of time, around about 10 to 15 minutes, just for them to relax so we can get them into their final shape. At this point, we need to make sure that it doesn't form a skin. We want to keep it protected, so we'd cover it with either a trolley rack, a cover, or a tea towel if you're at home. All right, so our bread's had its intermediate proof. We're now going to put it into its final shape. So we're going to use a couple of things. We're going to use couche, which is just a heavy linen material that we wrap the bread in. That creates its own microclimate and giving it the bread, retaining the moisture and allowing it to prove without forming a crust. Or we can use a cane basket, which we call a banneton. So let's start with the couche. We'll start with our 650s and we're going to turn this into a Vienna. I want you to imagine that this has divided into quarters, okay? You're then going to get the two top corners and fold them in. Turn it around, get the top two corners, fold them in, fold in, and then fold completely over, sealing on the bench. Then you're going to tighten it up, and getting this tightness in the dough is what helps you create the final shape. If it's too slack, there'll be too much sideways movement. So push to about the halfway mark, pull to the halfway mark, push until it's nice and tight, and then we can go and place it in our couche. So again, the Vienna. So bring the corners in, bring the tip in, turn it around, bring the corners in, bring the tip in, fold it in half, seal it, rub this part and this part of your palms along the bench, and that creates the points. Okay. Don't pull out when you're moulding the bread, actually push in and you'll create a nice fat middle in the bread, and then it's a beautiful torpedo shape. Place it on the couche, small fold, and that's where our next lot go. Okay. So, corners in, point in, turn it around, corners in, point in, fold in half, seal on the bench, push and pull until you get a tight skin, always moulding from underneath, never mould bread from the top. Place onto your couche. Now she's had her final shape, what we do is we'll just tuck her in and then place her for her final prove. Our next shape we're going to do is we're going to go into couche again, so we'll just make sure we've semolinaed the couche, make sure that it doesn't stick. This also gives your bread a little bit of texture when it comes out of the oven, so you've got that slightly coarser grain on the outside. So all we do is we square off our ends. We take the top edge, we fold it about a third down, push, creating a bit of tension, then we grab the edge again and slowly bring it down. This creates a cylinder. Okay, we don't have a fat middle and we don't have pointy ends, and this will create more of an even loaf. Flatten out, square off, tension, 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 and tighten. Place in your couche. You could make a song out of that. Tension, 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 tighten, tension, 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 tighten. When I place my bread in the couche, I always put it seam side down so I know where the seam is. If you put the seam up when it goes in the oven, it has a tendency to open up on you and crack. So with our bannetons, these are cane baskets. This is more traditional. We just give a light sprinkle of semolina, a little dust of flour, just to get those rings. And then we just round up our loaf, just like we did before, and so we can get nice tight ball out of it. Okay. Once we've got a nice tight round ball, we then place it upside down in our bannetons. This is how we shape a baguette. Now there are many, many different ways of shaping a baguette. This is just the way I do it. Once again, no claws, only flats. So we just pat the dough out slightly. Top edge, I bring it about 3/4 down, sealing it. Turn the loaf around, top edge, all the way down to the bench this time, sealing it off against the bench. Tighten it. Don't worry about length at the moment. This is where we just get tension in the dough. Okay, once we're happy with the tension, we then place our hands in the middle and slowly bring it out to the size that we want it. Okay. Place it in our couche and do that again. So flatten out, top edge down 3/4, turn it around, top edge all the way down to the bench, seal it, tension, shape. Now you notice that I haven't got any flour on my bench at the moment, because if I get too much flour, the doughs will start to slide and it won't get the tension that we need inside our dough. So once we get them into their final shape, we now need to let them prove. Now this can be done a number of ways. We can either retard it, which means we slow down the yeast and we extend its fermentation time, or we can just leave it at room temperature and it can prove at its own rate. I like to refrigerate this 4 degrees, and then I will give it around about 6 to 8 hours at around about 18 degrees for its final prove. What this will do is it will allow more flavour to develop, a slightly sourer profile will come through, and we'll also get, because of the low temperature proving, we'll get slightly blistered skin on the outer surface of our loaf of bread. So our bread's had its 8 hours at around about 18 degrees, and how do we know when it's ready to go in? So the bread will tell us. What we do is the press test. So what we want to do is we want to lightly press the dough and see how much it bounces back. If it bounces back around about halfway, it's ready to go in the oven. This tells you that there is still enough gluten structure present in our product to allow for the expansion in the oven. If I press it and it bounces back completely and there is no impression of my finger, it means it needs more time. If I press it and there's no movement within that fingerprint, then it's overproved and you'll get horizontal movement in your product instead of vertical. We need to get them off the couche onto these boards. I'm going to sol bake my sourdough, so just a little bit of semolina on our boards that will prevent them from sticking. just turn them on and then place them on the boards. So with your banneton, just turn the product over gently. These are our sourdough baguettes. We need to get these off. So a little bit different, we actually use a hand peel for this. This is just a bit of timber, helps us take it off and still maintain the shape of the baguette. So, well, now we've got our sourdough on our boards ready to be placed into our oven. We need to now slash them or score them. What this does for the bread is it creates a weak point in the bread. If we don't do the cut, it will crack or break wherever the weakest point of the bread is. So we make the weakest point. This also helps us to determine the shape of the bread in the final product, but it also can tell the person or the customer what our bread is by the certain cut that we do to it. We use a lame, which is just a razor blade on a stick effectively. Just place your blade on the product, making sure you've got a 30-degree angle and then slicing it towards yourself. Making sure that we undercut. There's your product. And that's your cut. If you use a straight blade, what happens is you just create a V. That bread goes that way, and then this internal bread just fills the hole. But with this way, what happens, this bit goes this way, this bit goes this way, and it pulls up that little flap of bread and gives you those beautiful ridges on top of your bread. Just slide them off the board. Make sure there's enough space between each product. We don't want blonde sides. And 3 seconds of steam, okay? And then I let it bake for 6 minutes, and then I give it another 3 seconds of steam after it's had 6 minutes of baking. This allows maximum expansion in the oven and gives me a beautiful crust on top of my product. If you don't have a steam injected oven, the best thing to do is you bake in a Dutch oven. Heat this up with your oven, place your product in it, score it, bake it, maximum temperature, 20 minutes with the lid on, 20 minutes with the lid off. See how our loaf has pulled off the bottom of the oven and you get these beautiful rounded sides. So all that shows you that all of our movement has been vertical and it's pulled the bottom of the bread off the baking deck. And that tells you that you proved your product right and you guessed the right stage to put in the oven. If I had a wide bread with right angle sides on the bottom of the loaf, it means it's been overproved and it started to collapse in the oven. The disadvantage of baking an underproved bread is it will tear down the sides. So if we have a look at it, if my bread was to tear along the bottom of my loaf, it would indicate that it's been underproved. We ultimately love to have them perfectly proved, and that'll give us the best flavour and the best looking loaf, but obviously we don't do it all the time. These are commercial ovens, so they hold the heat a little bit better, but effectively once you see colour on your bread, it has set its outer crust, and it means you can open and close the doors a little bit. They're not as delicate as cakes, but certainly don't open your door until you see colour on the crust. Ready? So what do we look for in a baked loaf of bread? I look for 3 colours, so a yellow, a golden brown and a burnish. So if we have a look on the loaf, we've got a beautiful yellow colour, golden brown, and just on the very ridges of them, it's slightly darker. And this will give us a broader flavour in our bread. It's not burnt, it's just one of the 3 chemical reactions that's occurring on the crust. We've got the caramelisation of simple sugars, we've got the dextrinisation of large carbohydrate molecules, but we've also got the browning of protein called the MacLeod reaction. And this is what gives our outer crust all of its flavour. So it's got the 3 colours, it sounds like a hollow box, but ultimately we don't know if it's ready until we do an internal temperature check. So my bread should be over 93 degrees, and at 93 degrees, all of our enzyme activity has ceased, all of our yeast activity is ceased, and all our starch is completely gelatinised. So let's cut into it and see what we've got. Okay. There we go, there's our internal crumb. So nice and open, some large holes, some small holes, and you can see that the bubbles are really shiny. That's because of the high acidity that's built up in the dough overnight. And we've got that beautiful soft internal crumb with that really crusty outer crust.